So with that, we're going to move into introductions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Again, Keith McKenzie, founder and president from Chinook M&A, based in Victoria, British Columbia, and Claire Gowdy, partner with Fasken in Toronto. So Keith, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thanks very much, Liz, for the introduction. Yeah, I'm happy to be here and excited to answer some questions and share some of our experiences. I'm really kind of excited to hear some of Claire's perspective. Our firm is pretty much a Main Street firm and represents sellers most of the time. So we do business transactions typically between 1 million and probably $8 million in enterprise value. And so our experience in seeing LOIs is maybe a bit different than other people's. Yeah, so I'm interested in talking about that and getting some more feedback and learning along the way as well. So looking forward to getting going.
Thanks,
Hi,
Keith.
everyone. I'm Claire. I know there was a little introduction on Fasken. I'm going to tell a little bit more because I know that all law firms kind of sound the same. So of all the firms in Canada, ours is one that has kind of national coverage. There's several that do. We have offices in Quebec, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, 2 in Calgary, and 2 in BC, as well as kind of 1 in London and 1 in South Africa. Of the firms, of those national firms, ours tends to be one that has kind of a broader specialist coverage. So we have standalone practices in a number of kind of niche areas: health law, technology, government relations, national security, like a whole bunch of different areas. And that enables us to help different industries in M&A. And then of the deals we do, some of the national firms will only focus on a kind of mid-size and greater, but we do the full gamut. So we do everything. We've got different teams for different kind of industries, deal size, company size. And so I practice mostly at the mid-market stage, but I have colleagues kind of across the gamut as well.
Perfect. Thanks, Claire. It was interesting. Claire and I we'll just ask everyone to put themselves on mute. Thanks very much. Just a couple of minutes before we jumped on here, Claire and I both discovered we're both originally from Prince Edward Island. So if you hear any accents like popping out from here from time to time, that's fine.
Right.
Yeah, we're gonna jump in with the relationship between the buyer and the seller, and how does that relationship really become the foundation of negotiations and how it plays a role. So Keith, if you want to start us off, is how is that relationship with the seller before getting to the offer stage? How does that come into play?
I believe it's really, really important. One of my partners suggests that the real goodwill of a deal involves a relationship between a buyer and seller, and I fundamentally believe that now. So what we try and strive for is to have the buyer and seller be introduced, have some conversations, get to a level of trust prior to an LOI being submitted. And once we have an LOI in place, that relationship between the buyer and seller sort of helps overcome a lot of the hurdles that happen sort of as transactions happen. There's always wrinkles, there's always things that sort of come up that cause stress. And if the buyer and seller have a positive relationship from the get-go, those stressors tend to be alleviated. So I think it's really important to be able to connect as a buyer, to connect on some level with your seller.
I have the same thing written down in my notes. Trust is everything. You can negotiate the perfect contract or have the perfect LOI, but there's always going to be things that you haven't thought about in advance or that come up in the process of diligence. And if you're fighting technicalities and you're letting your lawyers loose on the lawyers on the other side, you're going to get mired in details and off track. And especially if the seller is going to stick around post-closing to help with the transition or help with the business going forward, there has to be trust and there has to be alignment on values and on intention. So yeah, what Keith said, trust and understanding is everything.
Yeah, and I would say it's a challenge to get there, right? Because everybody is very, very afraid. Buyers are very afraid. They're putting in, they're typically putting up some personal guarantees. They're putting their house up. They're putting their future up. And a seller has one opportunity to make a play here. And so they're worried. There's typically a vendor note. Is that going to get paid? If it doesn't get paid, what happens? My employee is going to be taken care of. So everybody starts out in a position of fear. And I think over time, with the conversations, with going out for dinner and having Zoom calls and talking to everybody, you end up sort of becoming connected, and that helps with as you go forward. And there's always problems. I don't think I've ever seen a deal where there wasn't some consternation on one side or the other as you go through it.
Did you notice that during the pandemic, when you weren't able to meet in person, it affected kind of deal certainty?
Oh yeah, 100%, 100%. It's you know, that ability for folks to go out for dinner, and we're like, I don't know how you advise your clients, Clara, but in our case, especially once we've got a letter of intent in place, we encourage them to go out and get to know each other, like outside of brokers, outside of lawyers. Like, you know, you guys are all people, and if you can, you know, if you connect on a human level, then the rest of it seems to go a lot smoother.
Yeah, it's easier to hide behind a keyboard, I think, as we've all discovered. So
Yeah.
I feel like turning the videos on during the pandemic was actually helpful for the lawyers, because sometimes, like before, we were just all on a phone, and it was just a voice, and we weren't necessarily doing site visits. So the videos helped, but agree that in person there's nothing that kind of helps encourage the trust and the understanding better.
So I have another question on that. If, you know, in all situations, ideally a buyer can do the courting and you know, go for dinner and spend some more time together. But usually in some situations where it might be a more competitive bid process, they don't have the luxury of spending that much time together. Do you guys have any advice or things that you've seen where people have built, you know, some form of a relationship or an understanding when they don't have such an opportunity to be, you know, that interactive before they are asked to put in an offer letter? Is there any advice you have, even if it's just one phone call or one Zoom, especially for remote deals? What can someone do to build a relationship fast or with limited time?
I actually think that turning the video camera on makes such a difference. Like, I remember doing deals before, and like I said, like it was just kind of like a faceless voice. And then when the videos went on, you know, I saw someone on the other side with their cats, and all of a sudden I knew the name of their cats, you know, Nico and whatever the other one was. But like that actually just made a difference. It was a person on the other side, and it helped you kind of see where they were coming from. You can see reactions to what you're saying. So having that video conferencing ability, if you can't be in person, I think is really a big deal. And then just showing that you've done your research. You know, sometimes you have buyers that just throw out offers everywhere and see what sticks. But if you can demonstrate that you've actually learned the business, you understand the people behind it and their history, I think it can go a huge way to have the sellers understand that their businesses are understood.
Yeah,
That's a great.
oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Cleve.
No, I agree with that as well. And I think a big part of it, we do see a lot of folks just sort of, you know, put 3 or 4 or 5 LOIs in at the same time. And, you know, there's definitely a lack of commitment, it feels like, to any particular deal. I think asking good questions, I think it's always in your best interest to try and arrange a meeting, even if it's a Zoom call or even a phone call, with the seller prior to putting an LOI in. Most sellers, or I would say all sellers, are very interested in who the buyer is. So I think, Liz, that's one of the things that you do on your platform is really sort of drill down into who the buyer is and what they're looking for. You make them a real person even before you meet somebody. And I do see that there's a few buyers here in the ETA sort of space. I would definitely recommend that you guys, you know, that type of a buyer, make yourself real to the seller. You know, you're not just, you know, John's, you know, private equity group or whatever. Just make yourself a real person, so they understand that whatever business that they're looking to acquire is something that actually makes sense for them.
Absolutely. For the business owner, it's a very personal journey all the way through, and for the buyer, it's got to be a little personal too, even if you're sending out LOIs on a regular basis, trying to catch one. But Keith, when we chatted last week, and you shared a really interesting story where the buyer hadn't had the opportunity to meet the owners before they submitted an LOI, and they had a really creative way of catching the attention. Do you want us to tell that story? And then Claire, I'd love to hear if you have any stories on
Yeah, it was super cool. So we're in a situation, it's a small food manufacturing business, And it was competitive. We had two offers that were really solid, and then a group came in at kind of the last minute and went, "Oh, I think this is a really good fit for us." And we're like, "Oh, we have to respond to these other two offers in a couple of days." So they spent some time putting an offer together without having an opportunity to meet the owners. But one of the attributes of the target company was there's a specific number associated with the company, the number 44. So they made a full price offer plus $44 to recognize that. And then when we got on, like, everybody thought that was pretty cool. And then we got on the Zoom call with them after the offer was submitted to find out more and do a little bit more sort of buy sell diligence. And when we got on the Zoom call, there was a couple of products that these guys manufacture, this company manufactures. So those guys had put the products as their backgrounds in the Zoom call. So there was like there's like product placement behind them as they were talking to the owners. And it was very much like we've done some research. We really like the company, and they were sort of pulling out all the stops to make them be a bit more outstanding than everybody else. I thought it was a really interesting and unique way to go.
I'm not always involved at this stage, although I'd like to be, but one thing that can be helpful is to have folks in the data room. You know, you can track who's in a data room. And there's been so many deals where I've been on for the seller where they're like, "Oh yeah, we got a LOI, but like it looks like maybe one person opened a few documents in the data room." You see someone else has put, has a full team going through looking at everything and doing the research before the LOI goes in, and that actually, can demonstrate that people are tuned in, not just throwing something at a wall.
Yeah, actually, that's what on that point, the software that we use as our back end is called Deal Builder, and we're able to track even pre-LOI, just people coming in and looking at the sim, how much time they spend on each page, like how long looking at the financials, how long looking at the SWOT analysis, and that allows us as brokers to go, okay, this is a high target potential buyer because he's put in 2 hours looking at all the information, and somebody looks at it for 15 minutes and then fires an LOI across the board. We're happy to get them, but you're still a little concerned that they're not that serious.
Yeah, sometimes it's the subtle details of either party that really actually send a stronger message. Claire, you mentioned that you're not often in that point of the deal, maybe when they're making the first offer. Like, when is the ideal time for the lawyer to come in, or when do you prefer to come in?
I mean, I'm biased, so earlier is always better. Definitely, like on deals, sometimes I come in after LOI, sometimes before. I think deal certainty is at risk if you don't engage lawyers before, because everyone's very excited to talk about price and timing, like let's pay this amount and let's get it done as soon as possible. But there's a lot to go from point A to point B, and if you and your team haven't thought about kind of the full structure, the full legal risks and risk allocation at that LOI stage, often you get kind of deal principals saying, "Okay, great, we have a deal." And then it'll stall because the work hasn't been done in terms of kind of how it's going to shake out. So there's a way, there's obviously cost involved with having lawyers on too soon. You don't want to be doing full diligence before you even submit an offer, because we don't work on contingency. We work on an hourly basis, so understandable. But when you engage a lawyer early, you have them do kind of like a limited review of the LOI just to kind of do red flags and make sure that you've thought about everything and you're not skipping over kind of a key issue. Those deals I find get across the line with more certainty if you've had kind of the lawyers do the high level red flag issue spotting before, just to make sure that you're structuring in a way that has kind of like big deal points thought about in advance. And it's sometimes, it can help you structure, lawyers have done a million deals. They can help provide an idea before you sign that gets you kind of on the right track. Like sometimes things go in an LOI that are just from the last LOI. And so having kind of a second set of eyes thinking about what might make things quicker, might avoid risk. We can add a lot of value in a short amount of time, kind of in the pre-LOI stage.
Keith,
Yeah, our
comments?
oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So our perspective is a little bit different, I guess,
Yeah.
as sell-side brokers. We love lawyers and we definitely want them involved all the way along. What we try and do though is we try and have the principals agree on the commercial terms prior to getting legal advice. Because what we tend to find is, Claire's a little bit different. She's an M&A attorney and she's working primarily probably with other M&A attorneys. So the big deal stuff sort of they get that. But a lot of times we're working with counsel that is, they're not, this isn't their M&A isn't their full-time job. And
Yeah.
so they look at an LOI that comes in and then they'll spend a bunch of time sort of working on responses and redlining, a relatively simple letter of intent and making it. And then when that gets sent back to either the buyer or the seller, depending on where it comes from first, then they have to get their lawyer involved to review the red lines. And we're, back and forth for a month and a half, working on issues that aren't relevant because we still haven't settled the commercial terms.
Yeah.
So one of the clauses that we put in is we try and get them to execute the LOI prior to legal involvement, but we don't push that. We think it works better, but we put a clause in there that subject to review by professional advisors in writing. And typically what we see in that case is folks like Claire will come in and go, it's not perfect, but I can fix this issue in the PSA or the purchase and sale agreement. And it sort of speeds, from our perspective anyway, it speeds the process along. I don't know if it's the right approach, but we've seen it be more effective on the smaller deals.
I think that can be right. I think the danger is that sometimes a precedent is used that has a whole bunch of detail that hasn't been thought about by lawyers. So if you're going to do commercial terms, just do commercial terms. But don't get into drafting on restrictive covenants without the lawyer.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah, we've got.
But I've seen a number where it's like, okay, we'll just use this one. This is good. But
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of kind of technical stuff that hasn't been negotiated that is problematic that's then signed. So either the simple approach works or a more thorough approach, but kind of that middle approach can get you into trouble, I find.
I definitely agree with that. I think,
Yeah.
non-lawyers pretending to be lawyers as you're doing this is just a recipe for disaster.
Or I pulled an LOI off the internet and we were using that.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that we really, really push is make sure that you have a lawyer at some point and aren't just relying on, ChatGPT, and that the lawyer you are using does have M&A experience. Like when you're doing real estate transactions, it is not the same. Please look at having an M&A lawyer. It's one of our biggest things that we recommend. So, did you have another comment on that, Claire?
I can keep talking about that forever, but I'll let you move on.
Well, and between the two of you too, I didn't tell you this earlier, but we really encourage debate. If there's something where you guys do have a strongly different opinion, like we encourage it. We find it all entertaining. So, and it just brings out better dialogue. So
I find that sometimes there's clients who have used a kind of like mom and pop legal shop for most of the stuff, and they're scared. They have to get an M&A lawyer because the seller says they have to for whatever reason, or they decide they need to get an M&A lawyer, and they're scared to have those two people talk. That can end up running up the bill down the road. I've often worked with, whoever keeps the corporate minute books or the local real estate lawyer. And if the client puts us together earlier, like I'm not keen to do all of that work anyway. So the sooner I can be put in touch with the person who's closer to the company, the better. And the more we can just make sure that there isn't a gap between who's doing what, and that stuff can be pushed to the kind of most cost-effective lawyer.
I definitely agree with that. We're agreeing too much, Claire. It's not good. But yeah, we try and have an all hands meeting like almost right away and really just sort of start defining roles, who's going to be drafting this, who's going to, typically everybody kind of knows what's happening, but we get the principals involved so that they understand that they're, the people are talking to each other, their lawyers are in communication, their accountants may have to be in communication, and what documents will likely be required. And, sort out timelines. If we've been too aggressive in our LOI, we can close this in a month and a half, and, the lawyer's like, that's never going to happen. And like, but yeah, so we like to have that. Again, it's you start building that trust sort of as quickly as you can. And that involves your professionals as well. You want your accountant to trust the other accountant. You want your lawyer to trust the other lawyer. And, especially on the legal side, you definitely want to understand if there's gaps on one lawyer's sort of experience level versus the other, and how to overcome that. Is that might mean in your case, Claire, that you guys are doing the bulk of the work even as a seller, as a,
Yeah.
on a sell side, if the buy side lawyer is just not that experienced in the space, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I've drafted the other side's documents before because of resources or timing or, you know, whatever, but most of the times if you're not managing, if you're keeping us involved or you're keeping the lawyers involved, everyone's happy to go along with the process as long as it's kind of set out and yeah. There's been a few kind of train wrecks where my team has been managed and I kind of say, hey, like, is anyone doing that? Is anyone doing that? Is anyone doing that? And they're like, no, 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 we want to keep costs down. We want to keep costs down. We'll do the disclosure schedules or we'll do this diligence. And then, you know, you get to a week before closing and it turns out nothing was done in a way that should be done for a normal M&A deal. And then there's everyone scrambling. So
There's,
yeah,
yeah, I don't know if there's any way around it. There's always that last 2 week scramble. It
yeah,
doesn't matter how many times it's been pushed or what the closing date is. The last 2 weeks
yeah.
is always a bit of
It's a
everybody's running around
scramble.
like chickens with their heads cut off, and yeah, it's
Yeah.
mostly to satisfy banks, to be honest. So
Yeah, that's not wrong. The one thing I think you can do with lawyers that's helpful that sometimes people forget is they'll sign an LOI, they'll say, okay, now it's time for legal diligence, and they'll say, lawyers, go ahead. And depending on who your lawyers are, you know, if you're working with a US firm, like I've done a lot of work with Kirkland and Ellis, so I'm going to throw them under the bus. They have one diligence request list, and it's the same for a $2 billion deal as it is for a $1 million deal. And it's a nightmare. And they don't care what the target is. They just say, fill out this diligence request. And obviously for a smaller deal, no one has the resources to do that. So one of the best things I've had clients do is spend 30 minutes right off the bat being like, this is why if I'm acting for the buyer, this is why we're buying the company. This is what's valuable. We don't care about this. Because there's diligence, you know, employment diligence or intellectual property diligence that if there's no IP in the company that they care about, if it's an afterthought, like nip that in the bud and tell the lawyers they don't even have to care about it. Or if they're planning on retaining everyone, employment lawyers need to know that because that's one set of diligence versus if they're planning on downsizing and the IP is really the play. So spending 30 minutes kind of talking through the model, if you're the buyer and the value proposition, I think can really help your advising team kind of focus on what's important.
yeah, I wish more people
Good
would do that
advice.
because we get
Yeah.
to throw everything at the wall spaghetti a
Yeah.
lot. It's like,
But that's a communication issue, right? That's like the lawyers not being told kind of what the value proposition of the business is and just throwing, you know, here's our standard for this industry or this type of company, this size of company, here's what you get.
yeah.
So if you're buy side, you can really help the process, reduce the kind of diligence request burden on the sellers, because that obviously always becomes an issue and it's taxing and never ending. If you help your advising team kind of know what's important to you before,
Thanks,
not
Claire.
after.
Yeah.
That's great advice, Claire. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to get to some of our other questions here. We're running out of time already. This is great. But some of those, you know, price is one component, but what are some of those other non-financial elements that you've seen woven into an offer letter that make an impactful difference? Keith, do you want to?
Claire, you want I can, yeah. So,
Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
yeah, so I guess, you know, on a sort of on a more general note, what you want to do as a buyer when you're talking to a seller is understand a big part of it is understand the reason that they're selling. And once you understand the reason that they're selling and what's important to them, then you can construct an LOI or an offer based on that. So if the biggest thing to them is cash at close, if that's the most important thing, no risk, no vendor note, then structure your LOI with that in mind. If the biggest thing for them is, you know, keeping 30% of the company or rolling something over in the future, understand that's the key component. And so really what you want to do working with, you know, brokers like myself or with lawyers like Claire is really sort of trying to drill down into what the sellers are really want out of this. And a lot of times it's just cash. It's just like, you know, we want to sell our business. We've been doing it for 30 years and we just want money. And if that's the case, then it's a little bit different. And sometimes it's like we've got a really strong relationship with our employees. It's, you know, it's my son-in-law is the operations manager, and it's very important that we keep him on and keep him protected because it's our family legacy in that regard. So yeah, you just really, I think, really want to have a deep understanding of what the sellers want, and then tailor your offer around that.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, we've seen some offers win the bid because they led with employee kind of the value of the employees, and keeping that value centric to the deal. We've seen people win out just because they structured it where the employees got ownership in the deal, and the business owner, you know, leaves with a big fat paycheck, but they know they didn't get there alone. So some of those employee pieces can be stronger than they
Yeah.
would have known.
And,
Claire.
oh,
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Keith, do you want to?
Claire, I'm talking too much.
No, go ahead.
We can rally on this one. This is a good one.
Oh yeah, sorry. I was just thinking about another situation we had actually fairly recently, where the owner of a company's been the company's been around for 55 years roughly, and I think the sale price is around $6 million. And we had a buyer come in recently, and he had exited a business some time ago, and he was looking for his next acquisition. And he had built out a web page, you know, talking about his values and his history and everything like that. And he came in and just wanted to meet with the owner. So the owner agreed to meet with him. And prior to the meeting, the owner did a bunch of research on this particular buyer and looked at his website, really sort of got a understanding that this guy's an operator. He knows how to run a business. And his values really aligned with the owners in terms of sort of buying and holding and keeping something for a long time. It wasn't a private equity flip. And this particular owner, we've had, I think on that business, we've had 4 offers over the last year and a half or so, and he'd rejected all the offers because the alignment wasn't there. And so in this case, that looks like the alignment's there. I guess we'll find out as the time goes on, but that sort of ability to humanize himself and to really sort of put out the values that made sense to him also made sense to our seller in this case, and they might not always, but I think as the people that are looking to buy a business, putting that effort into, you know, creating your persona or what matters to you, I think makes a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Keith. Claire.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything to add. That's right. Nailed it. Yeah.
Perfect. So this is the seller financing topic is always of interest. I think we could talk about this for webinar upon webinar upon webinar, but introducing the concept of seller financing, or if and when it gets introduced into a deal, how are you guys typically addressing that? Like, Claire, for you, if you're on the sell side, Keith, you know, you're representing the seller. How is that getting introduced in a deal, or how are they receiving the concept of vendor financing? Claire, I can see you're rolling that one around.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I think things have changed in the past couple of years, right? Like the markets have changed a little bit, so it really is incumbent on the advisor to prep their client to know what to expect and whether that's going to be expected or not. In terms of seller financing, I don't know, Keith, you want to bail me out here?
Yeah, 100%. So it really, I think, depends on how you're accessing deal flow on the buy side. So if you're working through a broker, typically through a broker or through a represented company, anyway, somebody that wants to sell, that advisor is almost 100% sure going to be telling their client about seller financing or vendor financing and what the norm is, what the expectations are, and getting them to a place typically before you take it to market that this is going to be part of the deal. It's always part of the deal. Not always is a strong word, but it's mostly part of the deal. So get your head around it. Talk to your accountants, talk to your lawyers. You know, your lawyer's going to be writing a promissory note for this. What type of security are you going to be looking at, depending on the size of it? But we almost always sort of position our sellers to think about 10% at the start, and it may move up or down from there. But really to introduce the concept at that point. If you're working on an unrepresented deal, then your problems are, you've just got problems with seller notes if you want to sort of introducing that to somebody that isn't considering selling. like the first response from them, and typically especially if their attorney or accountant is sort of a long-standing sort of close relationship, they'll be like, why would you sell it to them? They have no money. That is literally the first thing that comes out that we hear. So if that's the approach that you're taking, I would say as a buyer that's trying to source deals like that, that you're going to have to do a lot of educating before you even talk about it, or before you even put it into an offer.
There anything from your perspective that you're seeing on that?
No, just that it adds so much complexity. So, like he said, the advisors really have to play a key role in setting expectations, because it just makes everything more complicated, move slower. Yeah. So it's kind of communication is key.
Yeah, it's I think it's really, if you're buying off-market deals, then I think you really got to be really sort of looking at cash plays, and
Yeah.
I think it's a lot harder to convince somebody that isn't up for sale to take a 20 or 25% sort of contingent note, second
Yeah.
position behind the primary financier. So yeah, it's more of a challenge.
Would you guys see any difference between the conversation of a promissory note being, fixed term, fixed interest rate over a period of time versus an earnout? Are you finding that those conversations are being had differently when you're having them?
Well, I can talk about this forever. Like on the small side, complexity kills deals every time. So if you've got a weird sort of earnout scenario, it's unlikely to be accepted. And if it is accepted, it's more than likely I'd say more than likely, but it's the chances of litigation post close are going to be quite a bit higher if there's an earnout component. Depending on what the earnouts, what the metrics are. I would, I think when we do presentations for accountants, we've got one of our slides is exactly that, is like is earnouts, get ready for litigation or something along those lines, because that's definitely a more likely outcome of that approach. I don't know, Claire, you
Yeah,
probably.
no, negotiating an earnout is terrible, because you kind of assume the whole premise is premised upon the business staying the same. And so if a buyer is buying for any reason other than to just maintain status quo, you're going to get into complexities after closing. So yeah, it's hard to
Yeah,
negotiate. It's expectations are often misaligned post closing, and yeah, it's a recipe for litigation. They're doable, and obviously if there's a lot of trust between the parties, they can be sorted, not necessarily through litigation.
yeah.
But it's difficult.
I think where they might work better is if there is some type of owner involvement, either like a rollover or a consulting agreement for a number of years.
Yeah.
That is the most likely case for success, where the owner still feels like they have some control. But as soon as somebody somebody writes a check and they own it themselves, like, the owner has zero control over what happens next. And so yeah, I mean, we talk about it a lot, but but we definitely advise strongly against it, unless it's really the only way to bridge a valuation gap of some kind. And if the valuation gap's that huge, a lot of times the sellers will just take sort of a meet me in the middle kind of, I don't want to do an earnout. I want, my business is worth $2 million. You want to pay 1.5 with a $500,000 earnout, just pay 1.75 and we'll call her good, and everybody goes on their way.
Yeah. Saves time and lawyers' fees too.
Yeah, and then it's the juice worth the squeeze, right? That in a lot of these cases, especially if you're, especially in the small side, if you're, the enterprise values $1 million, having an earnout of $200,000 and adding, I mean, I don't know what lawyers charge for that stuff, but it is sort of an extra document that has to be produced.
Yeah.
And then it's more challenges for both sides to get her across the finish line at that point. Then you got banks involved, and maybe they don't like the terms, and yeah, so
Yeah, and a bit of a conflict of interest, post closing as well, where even if a seller is involved in the business post closing, maximizing an earnout versus moving the business forward aren't necessarily the same objectives.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you do, I guess if you do go down the earnout road, and that's, you feel like you have to do it, make the metric as simple as possible. Like gross revenue is you know, if your business is growing, your sales are growing, then the profitability should be growing. And yeah, so that's the only way I advise if you're going to do it, is just one simple metric.
Yeah, we've seen a really complicated burnout before where it was like there was a minimum threshold and then based on EBITDA, future years EBITDA, and for every dollar above the threshold, they got paid $3. It was, I don't know, it's very unique.
Did
Um,
it get accepted, Liz? Did that one
it
get?
did get it was the sell side who actually proposed it that way too.
Hmm.
So it was interesting.
And did it
Um,
get paid out without?
it's in motion now.
Yeah, you'll
No,
have to report
so
back.
far, so far, no litigation as far as I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an interesting one. But can either of you share an example where, there was a creative solution interjected, like, and usually the creative solutions come out of the woodworks when these conversations are happening between, like, oh, do we include an earnout, or can we do more VTB, or those kinds of things. But any other solutions where you guys have seen to get over these hurdles or mitigate this kind of negotiation stalemate?
Uh, we did one a couple of years ago, in sort of a outdoor services company, like a home services company, and the offer was pretty strong, but there was some concerns around the ability of the vendor to access the capital gains exemption, because there's a bunch of criteria to meet, and he didn't meet one of them. So what we did is we structured the deal as a 60% asset purchase with a 40% share purchase in 2 years after it was cleaned up. And that, from the seller's perspective, because the deal was like, it was a reasonable size, I think around $2 million, but the tax hit on without being able to claim the capital gains exemption was probably $300,000 or $400,000, or right around $300,000. So it became unviable for him to do that. So we were able to sort of maximize his cash if he stayed with the business for 2 years as a minority owner, and then ultimately the business was purchased. The company that he was eligible for his capital gains exemption was purchased 2 years after the initial company was designed and purchased. It was pretty complicated. The lawyers, like, I will say, we respect lawyers a lot, but at the end of that deal, I was just like, you guys killed it. Like, both sides crushed it, to make that happen. So I think that was pretty creative and challenging. And, there was shareholders agreements and multiple purchase and sale agreements that were contingent upon things happening. But at the end of the day, I think both sides did pretty well, because the purchaser was able to access the knowledge of the vendor for 2 years as a partner in that business. So yeah, I think it actually worked out quite well. But it was complicated and very, very creative.
Yeah, that sounds cool. I would love to see the documents on that one. Yeah.
I'll hook you up.
Yeah.
Claire, any stories from the trenches?
Not off the top of my head. No, we can do whatever. Like, that's the fun in our job, right? Is you figure out kind of, it's always tax. You figure out what the tax concerns are and what the tax structuring needs to be, and you kind of work backwards from that. But the normal one is just like an indemnification or a flow through, a post-closing adjustment. Those sort of things is kind of what we see the most. But yeah, we can kind of draft anything that we need to. Yeah.
One of my favorite things about the whole sort of M&A space is that essentially there's no rules. It's only what you agree to. And I love that part of the job, is just as long as the buyer and seller agree to whatever they want to agree to. You want to keep my son as an employee for 20 years as part of the deal, but that's the deal. Just,
And if it's blessed by the tax advisors, then you write it down and you make sure it works and you make sure it has teeth, and then you go from there.
Yeah, it's so much different than a lot of things that you do in life, where you're sort of constrained. Here, you're really only constrained by your imagination and what people will accept.
Yeah.
So for the buyers out there, put on your thinking caps and be creative. But again, complexity kills deals. So I think it's like it in almost everything. It's like 90% of transactions happen roughly the same way, and then 10% you gotta really put your thinking cap on to try and figure out a way to get it done that works for both sides.
Yeah, creative problems, creative solutions, but sometimes just kind of using a standard form it's a standard form for a reason, right? It gets the deal across the line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those
It's
are,
something that we probably see that hinders some buyers when they're very new to the process is they don't fully understand how creative you can be and well, can I do this? Like, can I propose this? Like, yes,
Yeah.
yes. This is an arena where you don't have the goalposts that you do in other
Yeah.
activities. So,
But
um,
having that tax advisor close to say, no, you can't, no, you
yeah,
can't, yes, you can is paramount. Cause I've also
Mhm.
drafted a whole structure when a client was like, oh yeah, we've had our accountants look at this, drafted all the documents, and then the tax advisor finally looks at it, or the accountant finally looks at it and says, actually, you can't do that. So getting it blessed up front and then putting the pen to the paper or having the lawyers put the pen to the paper is the right order of things.
that's a really good
Yeah.
point. So yes, there are less boundaries, but check the tax man.
Yeah, I
Keith,
think on that note as well, it's like, especially in like in the deals that we do, we try and get the accountant involved very early in the process. So, and we do sort of a cash at close calculation based on the asking price, and
Yeah.
make sure that they run it by their accountant and financial advisors that this works. Because
Yeah.
definitely at the start of my career doing this, we lost a number of deals at the end because I didn't do that.
Yeah.
And you get to the finish line and it's like, then, oh, my accountant just looked at this and then, I can't retire on this, so I'm out.
My accountant just looked at this, just happened to me on the last deal. Like it's the worst. It's like, oh yeah, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Are you sure? Are you sure? Like, do you want me to get my tax advisor involved? No, it's okay. And then at this, oh, my tax advisor just looked at this 2 days before closing and it doesn't work. Got to restructure everything.
Well, at least the deals went for, I've lost so many, not so many at the start. I probably lost like 4 or 5 deals over a couple of years just because of, just because of that.
Yeah.
So.
So make sure your tax advisor is paying attention from the get-go.
And on the sell side, I would advise, as you're talking to your seller, or sorry, on the buy side, as you're talking to your seller, just make sure that they've done that, 2-hour phone call or 2-hour bit of work so that you're not going to die at the very end because the cash at close doesn't meet whatever needs that they have.
yeah, we've seen that too, where the buyer can actually push and encourage it. Like, here's a structure. This could be more tax advantageous to you. You should go talk to your tax planner about this. I know, like, maybe, and especially introducing, some other terms that maybe they're not as familiar with. It's like, hey, check this. Go get this checked. We've seen that too. My last question, what are the risks or rewards of paying too much for a business, and all opinion based? Like, paying too much for a business can be subjective, but like Keith, we had chatted about this question too. And in a competitive market, and we certainly feel like things are getting more competitive from the buy side, and especially as more people learn about ETA, it is getting more competitive. What can you share about
overpaying? Well, I say typically if the broker has put a price on the business, that is exactly the right price to pay, and you should pay that. I think that's key for all you sellers, all you buyers out there.
The broker?
Yeah, trust the broker. But no, I think when people, especially on the buy side, there's always their advisors are always more negative than they are, I would say. They're always more cautious, and so they're always concerned about paying too much for something. And in a lot of cases they might be they might be right. But what I always think about is, if what's your goal? Is your goal to own the business for 10 years, 15, 20 years? If that's your goal, and paying 10% more than you think it is worth based on it's a 3.4 times EBITDA multiple and it should be a 3.1 times. Over the course of 20 years, does that make any difference to you? Really, as a buyer, you're growing the business, you've got this great asset that you can work with. On the sell side, they've got the one opportunity to take the money. So trying to balance, your long-term goals with your short-term concerns about being overpaying for something or being played or something like that. I think if you start balancing your own future goals with the current conditions, sometimes you just come to the conclusion that paying an extra 0.5 times 0.5 of a return is worthwhile.
And I'm not necessarily involved in the valuation aspect, but in terms of negotiation, if both sides feel like they're getting a good deal, I can tell you the deal goes way quicker.
Yeah.
Because you're not, you're not fighting tooth and nail for little legal issues if you think you're getting a steal on a target, or if you think you're getting you're getting your payday. You're not gonna fight about little technical issues or little risk allocation if you feel like you're getting your payday. So I'm a proponent of overpaying because it makes my job easier.
I like it. I like it.
We
Yes.
have a few, well, did you have another comment there, Keith? And then I want to get to a few of the questions in the chat here.
No, let's go to questions.
Just go questions. Okay, we've got one here. What is a typical approach? And Claire, maybe this one might not be as much for you, but what is a typical approach to evaluating the asking price and determining an offer price beyond calculating the multiple? So Keith, you work more on the sell side, but you interact with buyers quite intimately when they're deciding what to offer. So I'll read the question one more time. What is a typical approach to evaluating the asking price and determining an offer price beyond calculating the multiple?
Well, I think it ultimately always comes down to a multiple, I guess. Yeah, so whether you're using sort of an income-based approach for valuation, like a discounted cash flow, or whether you're using a market-based approach, or even if you're just using an asset-based approach, they all end up at a multiple of something. So I'm not quite sure I understand the question, honestly.
Richard, I think that was yours. If you want to rephrase it in another way, I'm happy to ask it again. In the meantime, I'll move to Phil's here. Do you encourage written expressions of interest prior to an LOI, or do you prefer to keep it very informal at that stage? So do you encourage expression of interest in your, and I know it can vary from brokerage to brokerage and how the sell side runs their process. So that's one of my recommendations, is understand who's selling the business and what their process is, because usually they will share their process. But in either of your opinions, leading with an expression of interest, value, or
Claire, do you guys get involved in process much, or are you sort of
Sometimes,
Yeah.
sometimes it depends on kind of the size. My view, and maybe this is just personal, is that the more communication, the better, as long as you're not getting into a binding offer territory with the language and potential litigation. So as long as it's like a caveated expression of interest, I think that it just goes into the first question, the first topic we discussed, which is communication and getting to know buyer and seller. So I think that's good, as long as it's not as long as you've scrubbed it for any kind of binding language, then I think you're solid.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think a lot depends on how the business is being presented. If you're running a process, then you really are asking for an expression of interest based on limited information. So if you're doing that, if that's part of how you're trying to buy the business, then 100%. I think, I think sort of getting to, evaluation relatively quickly. Like we talk about getting to know as quickly as possible. So if we're selling a business for $2 million and somebody puts an expression of interest in for $1 million, then whatever, we've got to know very quickly. So it doesn't, like, thank you. This deal is never going to happen. But if that EOI comes in at, say, 1.8 million, then we're like, okay, yeah, then now we're at a place that we could talk. And at least understanding how they got to that EOI, and then maybe there's information that we haven't provided that can help them get the rest of the way, or maybe they've seen something that we didn't see. So I think it's valuable.
any other questions from the audience? I think we probably have time for one more if anyone has a question to pose.
I can rant in the meanwhile.
Sure.
The one thing I think, just from a legal perspective, everyone's focused on the LOI and then the definitive agreements. And I find often legal diligence is treated as a kind of confirmatory diligence, like make sure there's nothing wrong. But I think one of the best things you can do is kind of talk with your lawyers, talk with the other side in terms of what the expectations are for what might come up in diligence, whether something might come up that's a deal stopper, something might come up that's a price, like a price modification issue, or it's something that, will be dealt with through an indemnity. Because I think sometimes we go into deals and it really is just confirmatory diligence, like as long as there's nothing super bad, then we're going ahead with the original pricing and we're closing the deal. But there's been other deals where things come up in diligence that are material enough that change the offer. And so I think making sure parties are aligned on kind of the possibility for that or not is key to get to understand upfront.
I really like that and agree with that. We just did one recently where we basically put in the LOI, we put red lines in it. Like if you cross this line, we're not going forward. And
Yeah.
if you like, yeah, and it's very, very helpful because it like again, it's the idea of getting to know. Like if you're, 2024 EBITDA wasn't, whatever, $1 million, then we're not going forward. And
Yeah.
so I think it's a great way to do it because it gets right down to the heart of the matter. Like, am I going to buy it or not going to buy it? And I do think the idea of retrading, I don't know, you probably see this, you may see this more clear than I see it, but we don't see retrading all that often. Mostly we see walk away rather than a retrade. Is that your perspective as well?
I would say, yeah, probably more often than not the walk away, but not a insignificant amount of times it's a retrading based on something that is material that comes up in legal diligence or financial diligence.
Yeah. Our deals are sort of so Main Street that if something comes up, I don't like it, I'm out. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think as you get into more zeros, then you probably find ways to work around things that aren't exactly as hoped for.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for all of your shared stories and expertise today. I know there's a few nuggets I'm sure everyone's taking away from today. So thank you again for joining us, Keith and Claire. We really appreciate you spending the time with us. And as a side note too, I know there was lots of terminology and language thrown around today. We really encourage people, if there's a word or a term that that's not familiar to you, write it down. We also have a terminology glossary as well that we can provide if anyone's interested. But it is certainly part of learning acquisitions is learning the lingo that goes with it. So if you're not familiar with a word, don't be shy. You're probably not the only one, and certainly part of the learning journey. So with that, we'll adieu for today. So thank everyone for joining us and spending this time here with us. Again, we do these every month. So if this was your first one, you really enjoyed it, we do record them and they'll be put in our resource library and soon our new community. So stay tuned for announcements of the new community. But with that, we'll let everyone go for afternoon or lunch or whatever part of the country you're in. Thanks
very much,
everybody.
Liz.
Thanks, Liz.
Bye.
Bye.